Everybody, it is Matt Aguito. We are here live on Facebook. We're going to give people a few minutes to be able to join in for this very important civil conversation. I actually think all the conversations are pretty important. So excited to have this one today. So feel free to get your popcorn, get your drinks, and we're going to talk Asian. Talk Asian with Asians and a half Asian. He knows I love to pick with a mic. Um, Before we get started, I know you guys, like I said, technically, if you guys want to do the piece with the Facebook share, that would be great.
I did it right.
Awesome. So tonight is a special night. So the reason why I did this so everybody knows why I'm Asian and I'm here too. It's because there's a lot of history in regards to different types of minority groups in the U.S. And we've focused heavily on the African American history and the current civil unrest, right, and social justice movement, et cetera. But one of the things that I realized close to about maybe a month ago is that the Asian influence is pretty critical. From just from the overall relationship that has, the strife between African Americans and Asians over the last X amount of years to maybe the strife between Asians and white Americans over the X amount of years. And I thought it'd be really good to bring people from different Asian nation backgrounds, all still Asian American, but can give us a perspective that hopefully will help enlighten all of us going forward, right? And the goal, again, with civil conversations, like I've shared multiple times, all the other conversations, is to have the conversation, right? And not let the media, the mainstream media, dictate your purview of people, right? And I don't know if everybody on here stereotypically is amazing at math or is this or is that, and that's part of the stereotype with and Khan's already shaking her head no. That's part of the stereotype that comes with our view of Asian Americans, and we have all partaken of some form of Asian food, and hopefully that's not the limit to our knowledge of Asian people. So with that said, I wanted to give an opportunity for each one of them to introduce themselves. Then I'll just flow into the conversation, and then we'll go from there. For everyone that knows, I go by Ladies First Model. And so I'd like Khan to introduce herself first, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. My name is Khanh Nguyen, and I'm married to David almost 13 years now in a couple of weeks. I work overtime as a mother of two, because all mothers and parents work overtime, raising Milin is 11 and Kwa is 9, and they actually go to a Chinese immersion school. So they're starting to speak Chinese behind our backs and make fun of us probably. My family escaped from Vietnam as refugees in 1975. So we were part of that big first wave of refugees fleeing the war and coming over to many different countries such as the US. My passion is talking about culture and race. I've been a professor teaching on these topics in a predominantly white Christian higher ed institute, and I've done a lot of overseas work and training people in cultural competency as a kind of a side business. I'm also involved with an African refugee community, mostly refugees from the Congo. Mm-hmm. And I'm part of a multi-ethnic urban church. I live in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm a follower of Jesus. So that's a little bit about me.
Nice, thank you, Khan. I really appreciate that. Mike Ng.
Yes, I'm here. Matt, thank you for having me on. A little bit about me. I am married to a beautiful woman, my wife, Akia Ng. She has my last name now. So we've been married 6 years. So happy about that. I have 2 kids, Dean and Leo, 2 boys, one that is 5 and the other is 3, turns 4 later this month. So 2 small children. I am Asian. I know some people are like, he's Pacific. I mean, what is he? You know, I get that all the time. But I am half Black and half Chinese. My mother is African American and my dad is Chinese, which is an interesting mix in itself because every time I meet somebody that has my mix, it's the opposite way. So that's always interesting. I am based in a suburb of Atlanta, Alpharetta. And I work with Matt, and I am happy to have the conversation and give you kind of my weird experience, I guess, because it might be a little different than most. But here to partake in the conversations. I'm from California, but I live in Georgia, so I'm actually from the West Coast and have been in Atlanta since my wife is the best salesperson and got me to move to Atlanta. So, after that,
you did the right thing, man. You followed your wife, dude.
Exactly, right. So I guess I'm smart. So there you go. I'll pass it off to Josh now, but thank you for having me. Can't wait to have the discussion.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. And Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great. Just even hearing stories of the two other guys on this call or on this chat or live stream, whatever it may be. Just glad to be part of this. I always start by saying I'm a child of an immigrant. I immigrated with my parents. In our culture, I'm technically considered 1.5. First generation is the generation that immigrated here. And 0.5 is the children of immigrants that follows the parent here. So it was not our choice to come per se, but we experienced both ends of being an immigrant as well as being raised in America. So I grew up in Chicago, and I'm married to my beautiful wife, Lynn, who is second generation. She was born and raised in Miami, Florida. She's Korean American as well. And we've been married for about 7 years now. So 2 plus 1.5 equals about 3.5. We have one son who's 3.5, or no, I'm just kidding. He's basically third generation. We will consider him third generation Asian American. And he was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm a pastor of a local church here that Matt and I attend. And before we start, just because I attend a local church, I just have to say the views that I do express here are my own and not necessarily of my church. And the reason why I say that is just to make sure that I am loving my people well by sharing that as well. But thanks for having me. I'm really excited to learn from all of you.
Yep, I appreciate the intro, guys. And so for those who are just joined, I noticed the number is going up, which is great. Please, you guys participate, ask questions, make comments. That's the overall goal of this conversation. Josh, Mike, and Khanh are one individual representing themselves. Josh does not know everything about Korea. Khanh does not know everything about Vietnam, and Mike does not know everything about China. And he's half Black, so that puts him even down another half notch. So I think it's important for everybody to know that they're sharing perspectives, and they're also sharing experiences, and may also share experiences from others, right, to help us understand the Asian purview. So part of where I want to start really is more from a personal perspective, right, and just see how you guys are doing. If we can spend a minute each, and I'm going to do round robin going back the other way around. So I want to start with you, Josh, if you don't mind, to kind of set you up. It's just more of like, how are you doing in today's time when it comes to the social unrest right now that we have? I know a lot of the focus is on African Americans, and I have zero problem with that, obviously, because I am one. But then speaking from an Asian perspective, what is your perspective on things? How have you been?
Yeah, that's a great question to start off with, especially with coronavirus. When it first began, I think the xenophobia brought a lot of our attention of Asian Americans to the forefront. And rightly so in many ways, because of the references to the virus originating from China, Wuhan virus, Kung Fu virus, whatever you name it. We've seen a lot more increased attack on Asian Americans, personal testimonies to people. My own family, my wife and my mother-in-law was in Target, and there was a couple that actually intentionally moved away from them in the beginning of pandemic that happened. And I was talking to a friend of ours about this as well. During the time, a lot of our Black American friends actually reached out to Asian Americans. There was a lot of connections that was made. And for Asian Americans as well, for the first time in our lives, I think, not the first time, but more clearly than any other time before, now we kind of we knew what it feels to be a Black American walking down the street. Because I would have my parents even tell me they don't feel safe walking around the neighborhood. And now when the social unrest and the social racial injustice with death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor happened, there's a lot more understanding of, wow, this is daily life our Black American friends are going through. So there's actually a lot more crossover, a lot more connection than ever before. And I do see a lot more Asian Americans speaking up, marching, and becoming a voice, and really seeing the solidarity between, I actually saw this term, black and gold, as they would say. Not black and yellow, but black and gold.
Black and gold.
I see a lot of that. Yeah, and I see a lot of that happening where we do celebrate one another as well as stand together in light of systematic racism that impacts both races.
Wow, I appreciate that, man. Thank you for sharing your perspective. That's unfortunate about your family. You know, I think that, and we'll talk about this a bit more. I went to a Chinese restaurant a couple weeks ago, and you know, they kind of reflected the same thing to me. And you know, it was pretty eye-opening for me overall. Just some of that xenophobia and the concerns and et cetera that's happening amongst Asians. So that's not cool at all. Mike, how have you been, bro?
I mean, everything that's happened, I mean, it's put a spotlight on things that I guess from the Black community that we know go on a consistent basis, I would say. I have one of my aunts on my dad's side who is Chinese reach out to me kind of about the situation, but also kind of what Josh was saying of how people are acting different because she was Chinese, right? But, you know, for me, I was raised, I would say raised, you know, Black by a Black mother. So for me, I mean, all the stuff that's happened with social injustice, I mean, it's hit home very hard for me and my two boys. I guess, you know, as I guess we're procreating, we have made them less Asian, right? So they're only a quarter Asian, but they're raised Black too. So, you know, they have to deal with the world and how I've dealt with the world and stuff like that as well too. So it's kind of how I've been trying to make my way, but also, you know the change and be that person that people look to, you know that there's a friendly side on every type of race and religion and everything like that. So I just try to love everybody. So that's what I try to do on a consistent basis.
Man, I appreciate that, man. I appreciate that. And Khan?
Yeah, well, I feel like there have been two storms that hit at once. Right, first it was COVID, and then all the parents are trying to adjust to homeschooling. And I send my kids to school for the purpose so that I don't have to homeschool. And adjusting to that, and so dealing with what you brought up, Pastor Kim, the xenophobia. And here I'm in the Twin Cities here. There was one incident where a Hmong family out in a suburb had a note posted to their door, like, go home, Chinese people, or whatever, go back home, you know? And so people can't tell, an average person can't tell the difference between Chinese, Vietnamese, Hmong. So we're all lumped into this virus spreading, you know, xenophobic racism. So I was part of a Asian American collaboration that put out a statement against all this anti-Asian racism going on, and our church was dealing with those issues too. And then George Floyd hits. So I'm from St. Paul, and George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. We're Twin Cities, so just 15 minutes from here. And then that just bubbles up. If you're not living under a rock, you know what has been happening in the Twin Cities and all of the nation. So then that crisis happened too. And I just feel like there is something happening in both scenarios. And I saw a meme happen. I ran across a meme that said, nobody knew the revolution was going to happen in Minneapolis except for Prince. So I feel like there is a revolution happening, and I hope it is sustained. And our church, you know, responded to the George Floyd crisis, and now we're serving, like, the grocery stores were shut down, right? And the Walgreens were shut down. And so our church turned into a grocer overnight. And like for weeks, we were handing out groceries, and it started as a barbecue. but then it turned into people donating groceries like household items, diapers. And so our church was full of donations. So every day we would have this food drive, basically. And it's been such a wonderful thing to be a part of and to see how the community has responded to bless the community that is hurting. And so I hope that these two crises are a catalyst. And I know you're going to deal with it later too, but to talk about both anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism. And is there hope? What can we do?
And we will definitely cover that, because I think, I appreciate you all sharing your perspectives, because I think it's fairly unique within itself, because everybody has a unique story. But I think it's important to realize that, like when you said something about homeschooling, one of the things I think about is like we homeschool my daughter. Oh, well, heck, everyone's homeschooling their kids now, but primarily we homeschool my daughter now, and my son, he went on from homeschooling a couple years ago. And you almost like, I look at the skin, I look at the person talking, and she's not saying anything any different from what my wife would probably say in regards to the stuff that we're just trying to manage, right? You just happen to be Vietnamese American, right? You just look different. But I think sometimes we forget that we can all go through the same things. But then when it comes back to our culture and home, like with these two major crises, right? And this is what Josh was talking about earlier from the xenophobia standpoint. And then you're dealing with the African-American community after the George Floyd situation. And it's just like it's this constant kind of like struggle. But hopefully it's with, like you said earlier, Khanh, with the anti-Asian and the anti-Black piece, hopefully there can be some form of like unity, I guess you could say, between Blacks and Asians. And to be honest with you, I can't necessarily sit here and say, as controversial as this next statement is about to be, that, I can't say that, white people don't want to understand Blacks and Asians. I totally know white people that want to understand Blacks and Asians. So I think they want to be part of this like resolve of anti-ism. I just made that word up, I guess, but let's just go with that. So just to kind of like, before we jump too deep into before we go into one area, I wanted to talk about the George Floyd piece, right? And anybody can kind of talk about this specifically, but one thing that stood out to me, and there were two different conversations to have with two different Asians, and one of them is on this call, and the other one's not on this call. And it was the gentleman who was there. And those who've seen the George Floyd video, I've only seen the still. There was a gentleman there of Asian descent. He was a cop. If it bothered anyone, how did that make anyone feel when you see someone who is, he's not probably from your country, but we lump you all into one category anyway, right? So you're kind of stuck in that. What do you guys think of that? Any thoughts around that perspective?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. I think it just points to, so the cop was Hmong American,
Mm-hmm.
and there's been a lot of conversation around that. And I think it's just a symbol, okay, of Asian complicity in
Wow.
And turning away when a Black life is being snuffed out.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so much more than just this incident. It's just a microcosm of what in America we have not dealt with as the symptom of this disease of racism, and how Asians have been silent and not outspoken enough. Now there are in history exceptions like Yuri Kochiyama with Malcolm X, but broadly overall there is a complicity in the Asian community and an anti-Blackness in the Asian community that we really need to confess, acknowledge, and turn away from and change.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave it at that because I feel like you're gonna dive a little bit deeper into.
No, you can. I mean, if you had more to further, or if Josh or Mike have a comment to that, what do you guys think? How did you guys feel?
Yeah, I think, Matt and you and I talked about this, and I actually preached on this as well. In many ways, as I was watching, it really struck me a lot. It would be really hard too, because honestly, the initial thought was, why he's not doing anything? This initial anger is there at the person. And I think the second thing I talked about in the sermon that I preached as well is shame is there as well, of thinking like, oh, as a fellow Asian American, we have not done anything. And then the final emotion that I experienced was like, that is me. He's a picture of who I am and often how I grew up. And even sometimes in now, when things like this happen, the picture of complicity is not only out there as a person who's standing there, but he's actually a reflection, a mirror of who I am most of the times and how I was taught.
Mm-hmm.
Like to this day, if I would talk to my parents, first thing they ask me about is safety. Because if I were to tell them that I'm going to go march somewhere, if I'm going to go out, what they would say is, be safe out there. Don't do anything that will harm, put you in harm's way.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you're safe. So the idol of being safe to our parents taught us to look out for safety of our own first. So in many ways, it's complicity that's reflected in the years of education that we've been taught at home. Not out of evil intent, but out of survival instincts of our immigrant parents as well. But then that has led to complicity and a picture of who we are, even at this generation.
That's really good. I'm gonna dive deeper into that in a second. Mike, what are your thoughts on how did you feel? Because you're in an interesting spot. For those who are just now tuning in, right? Mike is half Black, half Chinese, but grew up pretty much an African American lifestyle. So African American life. Like honestly, when I talk to Mike, outside of his last name, I don't think about him being half Chinese. What is your thought on that? Being I don't know. In the middle is a fair statement to even say, but like, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, man. I mean, for me, it just was like anger, rage type situation, right? Like, regardless of it was to me, I didn't see, there was an Asian American that wasn't helping. To me, it was all the people wearing that badge were complicit to this horrific thing happening. So to me, it just glossed over me as anger and outrage. If I could just be completely honest,
You
like.
can be. That's the
Yeah,
point.
I mean, that's what I mean. It really, I mean, to me, that's all. I didn't see it as this different ethnicity not jumping in and doing. I just saw that everybody wearing that same badge was all complicit in what was happening. And so, to me, I didn't even. To me, when I first saw the video, I didn't even notice the person. I was just like, all these police ain't doing nothing.
Right.
And so that to me it just brewed anger, right? Like, and that for me, I know I'm not supposed to hate and be angry, and I try to keep myself calm, but to me it was like heartbreaking that nobody could take a stand, regardless whoever was there. You know what I mean? Like nobody could help, and so I felt, when I'm watching it, it's tearing me up inside because it's something that you want to jump in and help, right? So. That's kind of how I felt. I honestly did not like that guy's Asian. He's not doing nothing, right? I was just like, nah, he's wearing a badge and he ain't doing nothing, and that's not your job, right? Like that's your job is to help. So that's kind of how I took it.
Yeah, honestly, like when it was first brought up to me, Josh was one, and then another Asian later on. I didn't even prompt that person. Brought up the same things. Like there was an Asian guy there just standing there. Like again, this goes back to identification, right? And the reason I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit is that like I didn't see it either. Like I honestly didn't see an Asian dude there till it was pointed out to me. And when you know that's your people, like for me, I saw the black dude on the floor. That's what I saw. Like I saw the black dude on the ground. Mike, you saw the black dude on the ground. That doesn't mean that Josh and Khan didn't see the black guy on the ground, but they also saw one of their reflections, I guess you can say, and that person is Hmong. For those who don't know what Hmong is, I can't really define it that well, but we'll get you a definition, or maybe one of the three can jump in and explain that. But Hmong is not a place. Oh, go ahead.
Hmong are a people group, and they've come from an ethnic minority. They're spread out in Laos and Vietnam and Thailand, so they were also part of the Vietnam War, fighting in there. It's called the Secret War. So a lot of them have actually immigrated or were refugees, just like the Vietnamese people, and into the St. Paul, Twin Cities area. And probably the largest population of Hmong are here, maybe in California too. They kind of keep competing against each other, but so yeah, we have a large population of Hmong Americans here.
No, I appreciate you tightening up on that definition, because I think it's important for people who are watching to understand that, because even earlier in the conversation I said there's 48 Asian countries, and then maybe I said that earlier before the call, but there are 48 Asian countries, but then with Hmong, that's not necessarily a country, right?
Yeah, they don't have their own country.
They don't have their own country, but yet there are people. And I think that's also important too, to understand that mix as well. But before we go deeper into the flood, I want to just dive a little bit deeper into something Josh said. that's important. And I think a lot of this goes back to our history. And Khanh, you kind of touched this a little bit too. When I say our history, the Asian history, right? So there's a lot of history in regards to Asian Americans or Asians in America that has been pretty controversial, right? And it's shaped a lot of the way we view Asians in this nation, right? You're taking all of our jobs. We could say that. You guys are smarter than everyone else. You're coming in with cheap labor. You're like, the list goes on. And I feel like it's built this level of animosity towards the Asian community that may or may not be warranted, because I will touch on, and I definitely think it's important for us to touch on before we can, I definitely know that there's a lot of Asians who stand with Black people to help and Black people who have supported Asians, but there's still this undercurrent of strife between Blacks and Asians that I definitely want to touch. But before that, I just want to dive a little bit more into the history a little bit on that, and your perspective, whichever one of the three want to jump in on that, but your perspective on the way our history has impacted you today, right? Does that kind of make some sense in regard? Okay, so Khanh, is that something that you would like to kind of touch on first, or?
Sure. There's so many things that you said that I want to touch on, but what I want to recommend is a book to everyone by Erica Lee. She's a history professor here at the University of Minnesota. She wrote a book called The Making of Asian America.
Okay.
And also the PBS series called Asian Americans. It was so well done. It just, in March or May or something, it was broadcast, so you can find it online. Asian Americans, and it goes through the history of how Asians got here, from the Filipino farm workers to the Chinese railroad workers, and you'll see just the history of how, you know, all these different Asian groups came and struggled and fought for justice. Something you said that I wanted to address is, they're taking all our jobs. And first of all, we are Americans. So what American jobs are Asians taking if we're Americans? Okay? We have just as much right to those jobs as any other American. Some of us have been here for generations. Now, if you're talking about the so-called undocumented immigrants taking jobs, now that's a different issue. But I do want to point out that we're Americans too. So, and then the whole stereotype of being smart. If you label us, even positive stereotypes have a dark side, because if you label us smart, then that presumes there is a race that is dumb. So which races are dumb? Okay, so you have to be careful of positive stereotypes as well.
Yeah.
And so I could go into a whole history of you know, the Filipino farm workers coming here and being united with the Mexican farm workers. If you've heard of Cesar Chavez. Just watch that video, that documentary, and you'll learn a lot of this history. And then the Chinese coming here and building the railroads. But have you heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act?
Yeah, I was actually, I wanted to cover the Chinese Exclusion Act specifically, not to cut you off. I do want to cover that because I think, to me, in my minor research, I feel like, and I could be wrong here, and for those who know the history behind it, I feel like that was probably the most pivotal act that the U.S. did against anyone from an Asian nation or Eastern Asian nation that's impacted your existence here in the U.S. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, that was the first one that excluded a whole people group, right? So come on over and build our railroads for cheap labor, but we're not going to give you citizenship. I mean, does that sound familiar with what's happening right now for cheap labor, and we don't want to give you citizenship? So yeah, that's a huge impacting thing, but I'll let other people jump in here.
Yeah, Josh or Mike, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's the struggle the Asian Americans, I think, had, and Matt and I had a conversation about this as well, because for Asian American context, the struggle that I have had growing up in the States is to be recognized as American first, not as Asian first. So even the term Asian sometimes is a term that I have grown to not like as a young person. Because that just highlighted my difference. My name alone, how people try to pronounce it, and thinking, oh, that's so foreign, that's so exotic, that's so different. For a young child, that meant you don't belong here. Even the conversation that I would have with friends, or even many people, they'll say, so how about your people? My people are Chicago people. Like, but your people, I mean, who? Like Koreans? Like, what are you talking about? So even that, to be recognized as Korean, even like the other day, it was Independence Day, and my son saw an American flag on someone else's lawn and he wanted some. So he bought one from Target for like 99 cents and he was waving that flag because he was saying, I'm American. And that was such a surreal moment for me because as an immigrant, my first flag was an American flag. But for my child, as he's waving this flag, he's American as you could get. But the world is, the reality is when worlds look at him, they will say he's Korean boy first. And I think that's a frustrating part for me. And that was my heartbreak, especially when I was at a Korean church. We tend to move away from some of the things that hurt us in our broader society. And then we have so many history of stories of how we wanted to avoid being identified as Koreans. We adopted like American names. Like my name, Josh, was given to my aunt. There's actually no biblical basis behind it. She just said, your name's not going to be easy to pronounce in school. So here, let me just call you Josh. So that's how it was given to me, out of the convenience for other people, not for myself, or to celebrate my culture per se. And that perpetual desire, struggle to be accepted as American and being seen as perpetual outsiders. I think a struggle that not only happens to immigrants, but even second generation, third generation, including so many adopted children that do not have any history, any understanding of their native country, but they're often seen as, or called upon as experts, almost shamed in some sense. I think those are the struggle that we see.
Yeah, I think that's important, like what you just shared, the struggle and how that connects from just the way things have been in this nation. And I think it's obviously not just the Asians, right? To deal with. I've heard African Americans say something similar where they're like, I just call me black. Like I have nothing to do with Africa. But like, if I can flip this a little bit to the unique perspective that Mike has, right? What expectations has been put on you, just like walking in the door? Like you know, just the way you look today and then the way you were raised, like how does this, you know, kind of where Josh and Khanh were going, like how does that feel for you? You know what I'm saying, what I'm asking?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess it's a weird dynamic, right? Because if somebody sees me, I mean, they'll probably first, they're like, you know, Hawaiian or Polynesian or something like that, when I am half Chinese. So I guess the weird dynamic, the only time I really get that you're Asian is like, I guess, a resume or something like that, or somebody doesn't see my picture. They just get, you know, and I've been to countless interviews before LinkedIn got really big, where I go in for the interview and they're like, are you Michael Ing? Like, you know, they really like have to like confirm, like, because, you know, the stereotype is I was going to be a shorter Asian Chinese person, right? That's what I mean. And I'm from California. I went to UC Davis, and you know, it's highly populated with a lot of Caucasian and Asian people going to those schools as well. So I've been called into interviews, and they just think that I'm, you know, when they see me, they have to like confirm. What's interesting, I would say, is like I kind of look at it from like, I guess, my dad's perspective, right? Like my dad is full Chinese, but I don't know if he was so, he's not like I mean, he's definitely a Chinese American, but he's always, you know, never fit the stereotype of wanting to be like I guess the stereotypical Chinese person, right? I mean, hence, I mean, I was created, right? I mean, he had a black wife, right? Like, how often do you see a Chinese man with a black woman? It's pretty rare, right? So it's very rare. And my dad is one to not be quiet or submissive in any type. I've seen him be very confrontational. So he's one that has taken stereotypes and wanted to buck stereotypes, I feel. So when I see him, I know that he's not like a submissive type of person. He's always been like, no, like, I'm going to step forward into the light. So I think he has taken maybe some of the stereotypes and wanted to buck them. So I've seen kind of the opposite, if that makes sense,
It does.
Yeah, which is interesting. And I think he acts that way or projects that way, because I don't think he wants to fit that stereotype as well.
Do you happen to know, and if you don't know the answer to this, that's okay. Do you know why he probably feels that way? Because I've heard so much of the opposite right? From like, meaning like majority of the time I've heard is, you know, trying to be quiet, be just like almost like meek, blend in, don't say anything or we're going to get kicked out. Like literally, I'm quoting some like literally your fellow Asian people. Like, how did he get like that? Like, do you even know?
I don't know, maybe born in San Francisco. It's his personality that he's just, you know, it's very, you know, he's not like that, right? So it's, you know, so I mean, me being around him, I didn't think of being this submissive person either, right? Like I mean, you emulate when you're around your parents, right? And my mom and dad were together and they got a divorce when I was a young age, and I was around my mom, I would call my mom a strong Black woman, right? Like she worked 2 jobs, and you know what I mean? Like, yeah, and she ain't gonna take nothing from nobody, right? and then I got this dad who's Asian, who's very outspoken and, you know what I mean, willing to step up in the forefront. So I think I've never had the role placed on me like you should be submissive, right? Like, but I know the stereotype, but from what I was brought up as, it was never something that was like placed on me, I would say.
Well, I love to hear that, because I think too often Asians are silent and submissive, and you know, me, even as an Asian female, you know, growing up with the stereotype that you have to be in the kitchen, you're following your, you know, husband, you marry into your husband's family, you serve your mother-in-law. So fighting those stereotypes is a challenge too. So it's great to hear somebody bucking those stereotypes and speaking up. I like to say that, you know, Asians have been giving out this palatable sweet and sour sauce in our restaurants. It's time for some sriracha. We need to heat up this conversation a little bit.
Well, yeah, let's do that a little bit. I want to ask a question or make a comment around an area that I think is pretty sensitive, probably more personally sensitive for you guys. Then we're gonna jump into the Black and Asian kind of strife. The model minority, right? Like that's a title of something that I didn't understand up until last week, but I've heard it actually played out. Basically meaning this is going to bridge into some of the Black and Asian beef. I've heard myself, like, you know, from people who are not Asian or Black, how come you're not like these people, right? And basically these people are like the Asians, right? They come in, they do their job, they just work, they're not complaining, quote unquote, right? I guess that's a perception. They're doing everything right. You get where I'm going with all of that, right? That's a lot to live up to. And it could be frustrating for African Americans who are like, I don't want to hear that. Like, don't point to someone else for me to model after. I'm trying to be me. I got my struggles. That's their thing, right? Do you guys understand what I'm saying? You know, where I'm coming from with that? What are your thoughts on that? You know?
Well, I mean, for me, I've heard obviously the stereotype is the model, just
the model minority, yeah.
you hear it because there is a stereotype that Asian people in general are very hardworking, and they don't argue. They're not very argumentative, and they're just going to do a great job and not say anything, right? So, you know, when you have people that are in power that want no pushback or no different mind, like any type of different mindset, that's the stereotype they place on them. That's the stereotype that they want, right? So, you know, I mean, they kind of project out of what they want, right? And that's how they would hire somebody that they think is going to fit that description. And when they don't, you know, egg on their face. But you know, because not everybody's the same. Like stereotypes are stereotypes, right? Like to literally say everybody's the same is ridiculous, right? So, you know, that's just kind of how I feel about it.
So let me tell you a story about my husband. When my daughter was maybe 5 or 6, he asked her, "So what do you want to be when you grow up?" And she said, "An artist." And my husband gave her this look, like, oh, you know, and I just like slapped him. So then the next day I found this comedian, this Asian comedian, and talking about like, what are the 5 things Asian parents want their children to be, right? It's like doctor, engineer, lawyer, whatever. And then what are the 5 things that Asian parents don't want their children to be? It was like actor, artist. And so I showed that, you know, that article to my husband, and I just said, see, you need to stop, you know, getting her into this. You need to stop, or what am I trying to say? We need to break those stereotypes, right? But the model minority, sorry, I'm going to turn into my professor mode here. The model minority term was coined by a New York Times journalist in 1966. And the context was during the civil rights uprisings, right? And so the powers that be wanted to find a model minority to drive a wedge between those who were uprising and protesting and say, why don't you be like those Japanese quiet people? Why don't you Black community stop protesting civil rights and be like these Chinese people here who are so quiet? So that's problematic, right? Because it's used to drive a wedge between people who are being oppressed. And then another aspect of that was during the civil rights, there was an immigration law, right? We talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, where it excluded a lot of the Asian countries, right? And so in 1965-ish, there was an immigration act that kind of reversed that discrimination and allowed more Asians to come in. So the Asians who were coming in were either highly educated or had the means to come in, or come in as students in universities. And so it was very highly selective, kind of like the cream of the crop. So when you bring in the cream of the crop, you're not bringing in people from the slums, okay, of India or Vietnam or whatever. You're bringing in some educated people, so they have the means to get higher and higher, right? And so those are the model you see as the model minorities, the highly successful. They have the income coming in. If you see the South Asians coming in the high-tech jobs, so there were very select people that had those higher incomes. So people are saying, oh, look at them, why can't you be like them? And that's very problematic, because if you look at the groups from Asia that are on the lower income side, they're not the model minorities. They're coming in as refugees, as surviving in the low income jobs and stuff. And so, but we only look at those highly successful ones and say, hey, you poor urban people, why don't you be like them? And so it's, again, to kind of keep the status quo, right?
Yeah, and Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think this is I think Khanh mentioned this too. If we don't know our history, it's really hard for us to grow out of that. So meaning, you know, how we were raised, how my parents believed in many ways. Mike talked about this, to how we were taught to believe. The system that we grew up in often talked about following the model minority.
Yeah.
To say that we have to be a certain good way, and this is I found this amazing when I was talking to my senior pastor, who's a Black pastor, and we were talking about the different experiences growing up, and he talked about Black excellence. That you can't not just be good enough, but you have to be better than everybody else. And I just said, we have Asian excellence. We have to be better than everybody else, because the society doesn't really accept us as just being good enough. So there's a lot of similarities actually between different cultures, especially minorities here. And when we have a conversation, when we are serving together in different contexts, there's more that come out. But in many ways, we are really isolated from our history, and it becomes very subjective. This is what I was taught. I have a lot of Asian American friends that would tell me they never experienced racism in their life. I'm like, which country are you from? You know, like you and I are growing up in a totally different country context, but we grew up in the similar context, similar experiences. But because what we're taught from my parents, as well as what we were taught to believe from society, we just kind of brushed it off as, oh, that's because that's racism, that's not for us. And or we're taught to just fit into this mold, and that's what we're taught to do. So we have to know our history, and Khanh did a great job of pointing us to that. Knowing our history leads us away from subjective understanding of what it means to be Asian American.
Yeah, and first off, thank you guys for that. Like, I think I'm gonna go even deeper now a little bit. So like, the history is super, super critical, right? One of the things that I've been pressing a lot when I've been doing these civil conversations, like, we have to look back in time to understand why we're doing certain things today, right? There are behaviors, in my opinion, that we are all exhibiting, but we don't know why, right? So you go back to what you said, Khanh, around in 1966, the model minority was coined, right? And that during the civil rights movement, right? During a time where Black people were trying their best and their hardest and dying for equal rights, civil rights in the US, we get compared to Asians, right? I grew up in a time where I walk in the store, and I just have to cover this. I walk in the store, or you hear this. Actually, I'm going to speak plainly for my Black women here, okay? I'm just going to speak purely for my Black women. You know, they go to the hair salons. Not hair salon. They go to the hair shops. They get their nails done. They get these things from, let's say, from a beauty perspective, and they feel like, it's highly transactional, right? You go in, you pay, you walk out. But it also feels very cold and mean towards African Americans. Now, that has also been the thing on the flip side, where African Americans are like, some of them are just like, I'm just done with Asians. Like, I'm just kind of like, give me my hair, give me my nails done, and I'm out. Right. And I'll shut up here so somebody can comment in a bit. So I'm going to go to Cali for a bit, since Mike's from Cali. You think about, I think it's Cali. I forgot the name of the movie, but basically Shut Up and Buy. Right. The guy walks in the store. I forgot the name of the movie now. I'm having a brain fart. Guy walks in the store, and the Asian lady is following him around the store. Right. You see the stereotype being built. This is the early 90s. Right. And he's just like, I'm just trying to buy. I'm just trying to buy. And then as he's walking out the door, she says, I feel sorry for your mother. And he's like, what'd you say? Like, again, that was a movie, but for some people, that's reality, right? And it makes it harder for African Americans, I think, to not view the relationship outside of transactions, right? Because it's like that lack of trust. Am I making sense with this statement I'm going? So what do you think? I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead. You about to say something.
No, and it's, and what was said by like Khan and Josh is, like, there is that cream of the crop that have come over who have the means to be successful, right? Growing up in Northern California, we have a very high Filipino and Hmong population as well, too, right? So I've grown up around them. One of my mom's best friends is Filipino, right? And so their experience is not that cream of the crop. Their experience is growing up, socioeconomically, like how I grew up, right? So it's, I think it's, Asian gets lumped a lot of different ways, right? But there's still programs that are needed for, the Pacific Islander folks and stuff like that too, because they're raised completely different than somebody that comes over from, say, like Japan that's well off, or from China that is well off, that can pay for the education and is already highly educated. I think most people hone in and think that's it, but it's really, really not, because there's a whole spectrum of different Asian type of groups that, are underserved in their communities and stuff like that as well, too. And I've, witnessed and grew up with some as well, too. So that's my experience as well, growing up around like Filipino folks and my Filipino brothers and sisters is, that they have the same type of experience that, per se, an inner city Black person has had.
That's important. Sorry, Khan, you about to say something. Go ahead.
I think what has not been named yet here is that we're all fighting over the scraps of white supremacy and the white power structures that have, this is a whole other, lecture, but, we're fighting over this system that has oppressed the Africans, that stole the land from the natives, right? That brought over slaves, brought over the Chinese railroad workers, uses the Mexican labor for monetary gain. And so I feel like there's a bigger issue that puts people in these different hierarchical categories and class, not only race, but class.
Yeah.
And so we're all fighting over these scraps, whereas we should be in unity with one another, to question the status quo and to fight against the status quo and to fight for equity and justice for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of one thing, but I touch on what you mentioned about like nail salons and beauty salons?
Like just as a reminder, this is an open conversation to touch on anything that you want to, even if it's controversial. Like the whole point is to let's get it out on the table. And that's why I even touched it, because I wish I had a Black woman on here with me, because she would have definitely said it a different way. Maybe I need to get my wife in here or something. But I do have
an example, a story that one of my students had told me when I was, he was a Navy chief, African-American, and married to an African-American wife. And, you know, in my race and culture class, we were just talking about whatever, racism. And,
Right.
so he told me that his wife had gone into a nail salon and that the owners would not let her in. And then when she walked away, the owners let these two white women in. And it just broke my heart, because if you know anything about nail salons, it's probably owned by Vietnamese people, okay?
Right.
And so I just felt led. Sorry, I'm getting emotional.
No, it's
No, I'm not gonna be sorry for being emotional.
no. I'm about to say, don't be sorry. This is
right,
real.
right. Women need to check themselves on that. Anyway, that's a whole nother issue. So I felt led by the Lord to write a letter to his wife. I had never met his wife at all, but it just broke my heart so much. And he didn't say it was a Vietnamese nail salon. He just said, oh, some Asian woman. So they probably didn't know if they were Vietnamese. But I was led to write this letter to her, and I'm just going to read it because I had pulled it up here. And, you know, I told her that your husband told me what happened to you at this nail salon, and I, being Vietnamese, am deeply ashamed and grieved by this evil, wicked, racist act perpetrated on you by my fellow countrywomen. And I ask on behalf of them that you would find it in your heart to forgive them. And maybe you already have, but I need to confess the sins of my fellow countrywomen. And I doubt that they have repented or confessed themselves, which means there's not complete reconciliation or restored trust. But I hope that by me acknowledging this shameful act that reflects poorly on the Vietnamese people, that some healing would come to your heart. And you know, he was in another class of mine after that, maybe a year later, and he brought up that letter and said how, you know, it was a precious thing. I'm not doing this to pat myself on the back, but it was really something that I felt the Lord led me to do. And I think that's such a symbol of healing, where we in the Asian community need to confess our anti-Blackness, our anti-Black ideology and mentality, and not be in denial and stop like being trying to be white adjacent and assimilate into white culture, because we have been taught by this country to be anti-Black, right? And we can choose not to be, right? Even people of color can have white supremacist mentality, right? Even like Asians, we want to get our eyes, we have this eyelid surgery so that we look more Western, right? We need to cut that crap. And we need to confess our anti-Blackness and stand in solidarity and not be in denial anymore. And there's something about just being non-defensive, right, about our own people that I think can bring healing in these situations.
And Josh, I know you're about to chime in. I have to make this statement. First off, thank you, Khanh, for sharing that. I think it is super important. And I know you weren't trying to pat yourself on the back or anything like that. I think it is super important to hear that letter, for you to share that story, and to admit that there is an anti-Blackness that's being shared amongst people who are not Black. Heck, it's probably even shared amongst people who are Black. I'm just going to say it. And we need, and my fellow African Americans need to see and know that there are Asians who care, because our highly transactional relationship tells us otherwise. And when we leave the transactional aspect of our relationship and become more relational and communicative and actually build a community, I think we become more aware of things like what you just said, right? And because again, this is for your people. When I say your people, I'm going to speak specifically for Vietnamese. That hurt you because she represented who you were. And then collectively, as East Asians or Eastern Asians or Asians, however you look at it, us Americans are too, and it's unintentional, there's a level of ignorance to the view and picture of that. So we just lump them all in. So you see a Vietnamese who treats you this way, that's how the Chinese treat you, that's how the Korean treats you, that's how the Hmong, Filipino, it doesn't matter, right? That's how they all treat you. And I can't speak for everybody who's Black, but I can tell you the stories that's been relayed to me, and even in my own experiences, it can be tough and it feels harsh. So that helps. I really appreciate you sharing that. Josh, what were you about to say? I'm sorry, man. For cutting you off.
I mean, you're absolutely right about having the relationship and friendship and learning from one another, rubbing shoulder to shoulder with one another. I think one thing that I was telling my wife more than anything else this year, just being at our church, being with our members. I mean, we are a diverse church with Black Americans, white Americans, we have Asian Americans, and just being together, it made the experience of this whole social injustice all the more personal to us. And to learn from the history as I got to know my pastoral staff, learning from their stories, their background, and how they were raised. Even, we're talking about like Vietnamese owning nail salons, Koreans own all the cleaners in the world. A lot of beauty supply stores are owned by Korean Americans. The Chinese restaurants, and actually there's history behind it too. I recently learned this about how initially a lot of Asian Americans came over and they took the jobs, the quote unquote manly jobs, but they were actually forced out of those jobs, or they were lynched when they took on this more manly job. So they were pushed towards more service-oriented jobs.
Yes.
And we all know that we get our jobs to network. So when the immigrants come over, all the people that they look like are in the service industry. And that's all the know-how that they have. So they are in these industries, and they keep on perpetuating this generation of immigrants taking over Vietnamese salons, the Korean cleaners, and all that may be. And also on top of that, like you guys all touched upon it, because the system is set up itself, it's easier for immigrants to go into more impoverished neighborhood to start the business because of cheaper rent, cheaper, like the cost to start a business, rather than going into more high end because they don't have the cost to go there. So even if you go back to LA riots and whatnot too, you see there's conflict between Black Americans and Korean Americans because Korean Americans are in the Black neighborhoods. And actually when the riots happened, the police force was not in the community. They're actually out in the suburbs. Let Korean Americans fend for themselves. Yeah, and they let them fend for themselves. So there's more racial clash that happens as a result of that. So I think history really helps. Like I've been at the urging of, we have a resource center in our church that's focusing on growing together in understanding what it means to be a multi-ethnic church. And we've been doing a lot more studies. And one of the things my Black American friends are telling me in this resource center is like, you have to study the history. There's a lot of good books out there and you can read about it, about the current issues. But if you have no idea about the history, then it really doesn't help. So even kind of like Khanh was saying, knowing Asian American history of why we do certain things that we do, I think really helps. And sorry, my light just went out.
No, you're fine. Mike, any thoughts on this section here, man?
No, I mean, for me, I feel like, if somebody's walking around the store, they're gonna look at me and tell me to hurry up and buy, right? Like I'm just being honest, right? Like I don't like get a pass because I'm half Asian. They see me as a 6-foot Black dude, right? Like that's just kind of what it is, right? So they're just, I don't think I get some type of pass. They'll just think maybe he's mixed. They'll see my hair and say maybe he's something different. Yeah. But I don't know, my transactions with, if you're going to be kind of have some type of racial type of thing towards African Americans, you probably will have that towards me. So that's just kind of my experience, right? Like I don't get a pass to be like, oh, that guy's Asian. Like they don't. I mean, people that are highly racist not going to see that from me. So
right, they just see a Black guy basically. Somebody, I joked with him earlier today, somebody who looks like he's related to The Rock or something, right, or whatever, like that's, like you said, Asia Pacific, I feel you there. And I think a lot of this aspect, and I want to kind of pivot to something real quick in regards to your, not just you, Mike, but just everybody, like the expectations that we've put on you. There's a question that came up, and I don't know how to start this question, but I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. And actually, Khanh, you touched us a little bit with, stop trying to, I forget, you said eyelid surgery, which, by the way, that's the first time I've ever heard that.
Oh, it's a real thing, man. It's a real thing, dude.
And I realized I did this unintended pun when I said that. I said, we need to cut that crap out.
Yeah, I know, I caught that too, yeah. So, like, what about the fact that, do either of you, and Mike, this may not be the case for you because of what you look like, so you probably have a different level of expectation. We could talk about just some of the things that's happened with you in the past with being raised Black, but then you're Chinese mixed. What about being white? Like, have you guys ever, or at least know of people where you're like, you know what, I'm going to be as white as I possibly can? You already touched it, Khanh. Like, you know what I mean? Have you guys ever felt like you've had to be white? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean, it's
just kind of
because
that subject, that area.
Because the white culture is the dominant culture, right? It's not, I want to make a clarification. It's not bad to be white. God created all different colors, types of skin color. But if you learn the history of how white came to be, it was not a category until the European scientists and colonizers came and made that a category. They used to be English, Irish, French, and then they made the category of white. Categorize people by skin type. And so that is when it becomes problematic, when it is, you know, you have lighter skin, it's this hierarchy, and we're going to create institutions and laws to only, for example, let white men, landowning men become citizens, right? Or the Jim Crow laws, you know, or be enslaved in perpetuity or perpetually. And so, and so when that culture is dominant, there is, you have to kind of assimilate into that to succeed or to survive, right? And then you get passed down these ideologies that white is better, white is right, you go by white beauty standards, right? And you're educated in a white system that you're never, hardly ever taught from authors of color. I never had a professor of color until I went to seminary, and I had one. And then I was assigned the book, you know, it was like on global theology and Americans, minority Americans in Christianity. And so I never in college, because I went to a very dominant Christian education, white dominant Christian institution for my undergrad. And so when you're in this culture that is dominated by Eurocentric thinking, it's just easy to become white, you know, in their culture. And so I appreciate what Pastor Kim had said about, you know, just this struggle of, are we American or are we Asian? Are we always seen as this forever foreigner? Can we ever fit? Like just the other week, somebody questioned whether I could speak English. You know, it was such a microaggression, right? And I had already spoken English to them, you know. And anyway, it was kind of crazy. But yeah, so there's this pressure to assimilate into the whiteness, to kind of climb up that ladder.
No, I appreciate that. Josh, go ahead. What you about to say?
Yeah, and in many ways we believed it too, right? I mean, not so much for me as an immigrant child, because I always knew I am not from here. But my wife, who as a second generation grew up in Miami, she went to all white private school, and she actually had a moment when she realized she was not white. And she realized the product that she was trying to put on hair didn't really work for her hair. And that's the realization that she had, because she was so surrounded by the white people all her life. And I think there's a pressure to assimilate is so strong. And that is very prevalent everywhere, not only in terms of how we look, how we sound. Kind of like Khanh said, I have so many comments about my accent. And more so than the celebration of my dual bilingualness. Like it was more about, oh, you have an accent, I noticed. Where are you from? More than, you speak 2 languages? Wow, that's incredible. I only speak 1. I never heard that before in my life. Right. But then, you know, the challenge is like, it's more vast and wide, because not only in America, but if you think about the Asian countries too, I mean, what's the language that they teach in schools? They actually learn all English. English becomes a very common way that it permeates to a lot of cultures. And they often talk about, I mean, you never hear quote unquote American attempting to learn another language but English, or else even in Asian countries, they all try to learn English as well. And you see the system not only impacting America at large, but the world. It really is not an isolated American problem in some sense. It really is a worldwide way of seeing American culture as a dominant culture. And the pressure to assimilate is global, I think, more than anything else.
No, that's huge. And I think when you say that pressure and assimilation, and I know Khan mentioned this, and you kind of went even deeper. Just it's about the dominant culture, right? And a lot of that, a lot of that dominant culture here is also runs the economics in this nation. And if you need to get the money, you got to fit in, right? It's where you have Black people so similar, right? Where Black people are, for Mike and I in corporate America, not saying that you two haven't been in it, but for corporate America, we have to maybe speak a little bit more like this in order for us to ensure that we go very well through the interview process, right? And it's like, I don't want to do that. Sometimes I just want to be like, yo, look, give me the job. I can do it. I'm good. And so it's you have to almost code switch in order for you to be able to get into it. Mike, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, well, I mean, I was just gonna say, like, I mean, I think it comes to, I mean, you can say it's an Asian thing, but it's also a Black thing too. When you're in corporate America, like I said, I mean, like you said, Matt, it's how you're perceived, right? If you don't talk a certain type of way, you're gonna be looked upon as uneducated, or you can't hold a conversation with somebody, right? So,
Right.
Being a minority in general, especially in corporate America, you're held to a different standard. And I think most minorities kind of know that. And so going into it, I think you assimilate to a certain extent. Because at the end of the day, one of the most important things is how you're going to provide for your family, and however you're going to provide, right? And if that sounds different, the way that you need to talk, then it needs to sound different, right? And people are okay with assimilating when it comes to getting a job and things like that. And I think that's across the board to many different races, to be honest. And when somebody doesn't, I mean, Matt, you've been a part of experience where we've met somebody who hasn't assimilated that kind of cadence or speak, and I've had to have that conversation of pulling somebody aside and say, you're held to a different standard, and you're going to have to,
you got
speak
to
a little
clean it up.
differently. You got to clean it up. It's got to be tighter. So, I mean, there is those examples as well. So
to kind of pivot a little bit more focus on you, Mike, because of the uniqueness you have, I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into you. Being a Black Chinese man, or Chinese Black, I mean, you identify as a Black man. I've never heard you identify it any other way, right? And a lot of that is tied to your culture, right? How you were raised. Your mom raised you. You grew up amongst your Black family primarily, correct? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
So there's a level of assimilation I'm sure a lot of people who have taken on that are Asian that are similar to like Josh and Khan. But in your case, and you kind of shared this with me, but we can go into your story a little bit. Now with you being raised Black, what were the things that you kind of struggled with, or like that came up that was like, I'm Black, but this moment right here just proved that I'm not 100% Black. Like, you know where I'm going?
Yeah, no, 100%, man. I give you one that's real light, man. It's real light. But all my cousins who live with us and I grew up around, right? They had, the fades and the tapers, and they had the 360 waves, right? So, I'm like, hey, man, let me get some Murrays, let me get some sporting waves, put my do-rag on, let me get my 360 waves, right? Like, you know what I mean? That's what my family's doing. That's the look. Let me go ahead and do that. So, I'm wearing the wave cap every day. I got the line in the head. It's official, right? Like, I got to do, you know what I mean? Like, I ain't wearing it every day. I'm brushing. I'm putting my Murrays on. I'm putting on my sporting waves. But that Asian reel comes out in the hair, right? Like, my hair is not going to get waves, man. So, it's just, I'm with my cousins. I played sports with them. I'm with them. But certain things that was one thing. I mean, it's very trivial because it's just hair, but it really is like, oh, Mike can't do the same things that we're doing to a certain extent, right? So it's a light story, but it kind of highlighted like, hey, this is my cousin. We're always together, but like when it comes to the hair, like we all doing the same things, but your result a little different, right? Like because I am, Chinese and my hair is not prototypical to, a Black person's hair, right? So and my kids are kind of not either, right? Even though they're 75% Black. So I don't know if my kids would get waves either. So I don't think we're going to test it, but I don't know if they have to have that realization as well. But if they do, they're going to have the same fate as me and then realize they got that 25% of something, right? 25% of Chinese.
And so I appreciate you sharing that story. I find it hilarious, obviously, because, Murray's hair grease is definitely pretty popular grease, especially back in the day amongst us Black folk. Well, I had hair, I had waves. it's gone now. The only waves I have is probably the rolls in the back of my neck. But the thing about your story, I guess the question I have is like, did you feel almost like left out of something that you were raised in culturally, right? Like meaning you're Black, but like how did you feel? Did you just not care? Did you get over it, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta be. I mean, gotta have the tough skin though, right? I can be.
Right.
My hair still not gonna work. So you know what I mean? They grew up with a tough skin, but I mean, it did suck, right? Like, because I could do the same thing that this is my family. This is people that I'm with every day. Like, we
Yeah.
go play football, we go play basketball, and we do everything together. We play video games together. But this is the one thing I'm just different, right? Like, I'm just different. You know what I mean? Like how I looked at it, right? So. I mean, it did suck to a certain extent. I mean, definitely get over it and things like that. But it just, we family, but it's just a little different, right? Like, and I've come to grips with that, and I know my uniqueness, right? As I embrace it. But at the moment, when you're younger, you just want to be with your friends, right? You assimilate to your group, right? Regardless. And so when you can't do that, you question like why am I different, right? So it wasn't a big question where I had to like go to therapy for or something like that. It was just kind of like
Right.
it was just kind of a little different, right? Like I can't do what my peers are doing or my cousins and stuff like that.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. And so like I want to pivot to another point here when it comes to like this generation, right? And I kind of touched this on some of my conversations because I know like we have some time left, but not a whole lot. But I want to cover this because there's action I think that always needs to either be stated, that needs to happen going forward. But in this generation, right, we're all alive now. We're all trying to figure this stuff out. I've been calling, I didn't say this on any of my calls, but I've been calling this almost like we're the transition generation. Like I feel like all of the stuff that's happened over history that's put us in the place where we are right now, we're going through the pains of like turning the ship in some form or fashion to whatever this nation is going to look like. And I mean, Mike, you can start, and then maybe I'll go to Khan next, and then Josh. Like when it comes to you now and then your kids, like how are you looking at this, and the people who you're around? How are you looking at this to help change this going forward? Right? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, and one thing that Khan and Josh both brought up that I thought was great was history, right? Like I probably should do a better job with my kids teaching them history, just so they know the context if they run into, I feel like we're moving the ship in the right direction, but it takes a long time to turn a big ship, right? So will my kids, they're going to be raised in I guess, predominantly, affluent white neighborhood, and they're going to be Black. I mean, they might be a quarter Asian, but they're going to be raised, they're going to be two Black boys. So with that in mind, I just, teach them the history, teaching them, why somebody could act differently towards you and things like that. I think I have to do that as a parent, especially as a Black parent, or even if you're an Asian parent, I think you have to do that, right? Like I want to teach my kids love everybody, like I said, right? But at the same time, they just need to have that understanding that some people don't have that same view of love towards every race or religion or just anything, right? Like I tell my motto is to love everybody. Like I really me and my wife have the same type of motto. We taken our kids to the drag story time to see a drag queen tell stories, because I want my kids to feel like everybody can be included and everybody is just seen as a person. So that's just my biggest thing, and how I approach it, I guess.
Got you. No, I appreciate that. That's good. Khan, any thoughts on that for you?
Yeah, for my kids, I want to expose them to different cultures, and that's why we go to a multi-ethnic church and involved with this African refugee community. And they go, like I said, send them to Chinese immersion school, since China's a superpower. If you can't beat them, join them, right? And so at least they're getting some Asian authority figures in their life, but most importantly for me and my family, I had them when they were little, in the little children's Bible books. I had them color Jesus brown, because I want them to follow brown Jesus, not a whitewashed, colonizing, imperialistic Jesus that has been exported all over the world. I want them to follow a Jesus who was poor, was a refugee, an immigrant. He was a persecuted ethnic minority. He faced police brutality, and he was executed by the state as a criminal for a crime he didn't commit. And so every category that I just named is what a colonized mind doesn't want in this country: the poor, the immigrant, the refugee, right? Those facing police brutality. And I want to teach them that, you know what, God loves the world, but God advocates for the poor and the marginalized and those who are oppressed. And so that's what I want to teach them, that this is the Jesus who breaks down walls of hostility between people groups. And he died for us so that we could build a community of love and stand up against communities of oppression.
No, that's really good. And but Josh, before you go, I want to dive a little bit more into what you just said, Khanh. And you said a lot of beautiful things. When it comes to the poor, the refugee, the least of us, you can say, right? And the Asian community, right? It sounds like to me, and this is just at least with you three, right? So I'm not going to sit here and assume that this is everyone, that the level of empathy that you have for African Americans is pretty high. But like trying to, and of course, because of what you've been through as well, right? We're all kind of in this together. How do we, I guess these conversations, how do we deepen that across the Asian community, right? And also the same thing in African American community, right? What would you tell me if I was, let's speak to half of Mike and all of me. I'm just picking, but like basically, what would you tell me? And also, how do we deal with the Asian community and say, like, how do we, what can we do? Because I'll be honest with you, like even now, I mean, I'm not going to run out here and just start running to every Asian out here and just give them a hug. But at the same time, you know, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of tension, but we are dealing with some of the similar, and I will never say it's the same at all, but similar storylines in regards to oppression, history, you'd say white America, et cetera, right? But, you know, what do we do? How do we address it?
I guess I would first say, please forgive us. Forgive us for standing there while someone's foot or knee was on your neck. Forgive us and help us do better. Let's commune together. I mean, it starts with relationships and understanding, and then fighting these systems of oppression together. I mean, just learning from each other. Like Mike, we're talking about all these different hairstyles. Like, it was way over my head. I've learned like 5 different vocabulary words in one session there, and so learning from each other and standing in solidarity with each other. And like, there are examples in history. Like Pastor Kim brought up the LA riots. In this documentary, I learned that after those riots, the Korean community and the Black community, they marched in peace together. There was a united front there, and I had never known that before. I just heard about all the fighting between them, right? And so building those coalitions together, and that means being in relationship and community with one another and getting out of our ethnic enclaves and learning from one another and following the lead. I mean, African Americans have led so strongly in this whole history of civil rights, and so we need to follow your lead and learn from you.
And thank you for saying that, because Josh, I know you're waiting to say something. I apologize. I just have to do like this. I appreciate you saying that, especially when you say African Americans have led. Like, it is hard at some points, you know. Again, I don't have as many outside of picking up some food or maybe some coworkers. Like, I don't necessarily interact a whole lot with Asians all the time, but like, it's hard to hear my sisters, my Black sisters, just get frustrated with dealing with some of the animosity. And then you hear some of them say, you know, if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't even be here, or this or that, or like, we're putting our Black dollars into your pocket. So it's almost like there has to be some type of change. There has to be some type, and again, I'm not sitting here saying that every interaction is only one-sided's fault either, right? I mean, I get it, but I appreciate you saying forgive us. And, you know, because again, I can't speak for everybody Black, So I'm not going to sit here and say that everyone's going to listen to this all of a sudden forgive, but it does take 1, 2, maybe 3 stories like we have here to be able to say like, okay, there are some Asians out there that get it and they're trying to work with us. And we know that there's more, right? We know that there's more. But yeah,
And Matt, I'm sorry, I just jump in too.
No, jump in.
No, I was just gonna say is like there's if you sit back and look at it, like as much as people want to divide, there's more similarities as being a minority regardless. There's just so many similarities. And if, like Khan said, we have to be united because we all go through the same type of things, but yet we are divided. If we were unified and we're all facing the same type of struggles, we can be very powerful. We're not segregated minorities now. We are one united front. So I think that's one thing to look at. It all comes with empathy and love, right? Like you got to be able to have empathy for the person that doesn't look like you as well too, right? But has gone through most likely similar things, or their history has gone through similar things as you as well too, but understanding that is the truth though. I was going to give you the simple answer to fix it, is just start making more Tiger Woods and Mike Ings, and easy, right? But but no, I mean at the end of the day, like I really think it's just, we can be united if we really look at all of our our similarities and not harp on our differences. To be honest, I think that's the best way to move forward and work together.
No, that's good, man. Josh?
Yeah, and you touched upon it a little bit with the initial question about generations. Because in many ways, I think there are generations there too. Generations of first generation immigrants, second generation have grown up here, third generation. And, I served in a Korean American church for a while. And the different perspective between generation is amazing. I mean, a first generation immigrant perspective of George Floyd's death is completely different than second generation Korean Americans' perspective in George Floyd's death. And all the more so in different generations. So sometimes not only do we lump all the Asian Americans together into one gigantic subgroup, but sometimes we also forget that some of these guys are immigrants, some of these guys are not immigrants. And their immigrant experience is different than non-immigrant experience. And that's the struggle of being an American and not American. Whereas the first generation, they know they don't want to be actually American. They actually want to be, a lot of my parents and their generation want to make enough money to go back to their country. Whereas second generation, this is their country. So it's more complex. So some people that you might come across, they may be first generation, and then some people you may come across, they're second generation, and their perspective is completely different, although they kind of look alike. And I think that's a big thing as well in dealing with different people. And in a Korean, there's a term called Han, which is about anguish in your heart. And that is something that I don't fully understand as second generation. But my goodness, if you don't understand that when dealing with the first generation, you can relate to that. And that's the depth of history that we often don't have in dealing with different groups of people, experiences that we often kind of generalize into thinking this is a general idea or experience of what it may be. And to answer your initial question about how do we change, and I think that's the biggest question for us, what's next for us, right? In many ways, we are going to struggle, but what is it for our children in many ways? What are they going to look like? And Matt knows this too. I mean, one of the reasons I came to our church, in my numerous conversations with my head pastor, and one conversation I still remember to this day that just blew my mind. And we're just talking about our life, just having a breakfast, talking about raising children. And he has 2 older boys, and he just simply said, my 2 boys love being Black. And I don't know I struggled to raise them in a multi-ethnic church context. And he said a lot of other stuff after that, but only thing I heard was he loves being what? Their kids love being Black. And for the longest time in my life, I didn't know what it means to love being Asian American. I always wanted to not be Asian American because I want to be American first. So I came home and I told my wife, I want to be at a place where I could learn to be celebrated. I want to be celebrated as who I am, how God made me. And I need to be at this place where we can both learn what it means not to highlight who we are, but celebrate how God has designed me to be. And I think that's important for my son to grow up and see that. And this was like the proud moment my wife and I had. We're playing Snake and Letters, and there were three characters. One's a black man, one's a white man, well, black boy and white boy, and then Asian American girl, right? So we're asking, who do you want to be? And then, of course, he didn't pick a girl, and we're like, okay, why is there Asian American girl only? There's another whole issue with that as well. But and then as he was debating between a black boy and a white boy, he actually chose a black boy. And we actually, my wife and I looked at each other and like, wow. Like we've been at this church and we have seen different people lead us spiritually. We have white elders, black elders, we have Asian American elder. And for him to see that and grow up, to have that perspective meant the world to us. And for him to be not highlighted as Asian American, but to be celebrated and made in the image of God. I think that's where we start in our family.
That was amazing. Khanh, I don't know if you were about to say something, but I will jump in. Like, I think, first of all, three of your perspectives were great, especially when it comes to the action that needs to be taken. One of the things that's so difficult and complicated with all of this is that it takes baby steps to get there. And I'm hoping that, again, Civil Conversations is designed to have, we can't even go deep. Like, we just can't. And that's why I wanted this conversation to shape the way it went, because there needed to be enough of the personal aspect that you guys are bringing, plus some history. But then we need people to be able to branch out and dig into the history. We may need another part of this. I mean, honestly, I may need to just pull Khanh and do a one-on-one, because I have one-on-one conversations, and she just helps me break down history. Like, I mean, because it's super important, because it's how we got here. One of the things that I struggle with, the two things I struggle with, one is the lack of like wanting to look at history, right? Because sometimes people just want to ignore it. They're like, we already did that and we wrote a law that removed it, so let's ignore it. Well, it's hard to do that because habits were formed over the last like 50, 60 years. So even if that law has been ripped out, like just abolished, the habits are there. The habits are there, right? And, and that's important. So we have to look at why, so we can look at what we need to change going forward. And we can only change that through the habits. And I think like that's super important. The other piece is like when you brought up being a proud Asian, proud your heritage, and like how you heard being black and proud, or I'm proud of being black, or a lot of that I think reflects on sometimes the thinking of like, and unfortunately when you said you didn't feel like you never thought about that, it's I don't see color mentality. Not you, but just some people like that. I don't see color thing is unfortunate, because seeing the reason why I feel like it came up is to try to erase like, oh, I'm not judging you based on the color of your skin. But I think the problem is that it also eliminated the ability to be able to embrace the culture that comes with that color of skin, right? To come with a black, come with a Asian, come with the mix, and be able to just say, this is me, this is what I bring. I bring my Korean heritage into the United States of America, and I'm now American. I bring my Vietnamese heritage, I bring my black and Chinese heritage in, and I'm proud to be that. You know what I mean? And it's unfortunate that we can't just do that amongst all black people. I got a shirt in there that says Black women are beautiful. We don't mind doing that, but I want to see every culture. Look, black and Puerto Rican is hilarious, right? I'll just bring Puerto Ricans in. Puerto Rico, we don't mind doing that. I want to see Asians get out there and be like, yo, Korea, what's up? Vietnamese, what's up? China, we in the his out. Like, I'm not saying you're gonna talk like that, but do it, right? And be respectful of other cultures, but let's kind of try to figure each other out so we can move forward. Khanh, were you gonna say something real quick? And then I'm gonna eventually kind of come to a close on this, but Khanh?
Oh, something I've learned from the African community is this bird called the Sankofa bird. It's a mythical bird that kind of looks behind while walking forward. Mm-hmm. And the phrase is called, it is not wrong to go back for what you have lost. Mm. And so the idea of looking into history as you're moving forward, so that you can learn the lessons of history, right? And even what Pastor Kim was saying, recover that culture that you have lost, so that we don't make the same mistakes that we have in the past as we move forward.
No, I think that's beautiful. That's super important. I want to address a couple of quick comments. Talia website. I don't know if you're still watching. No, and I know some people came in a little bit late. Khan is speaking and not speaking for all Asians. So I know you made a comment, you can't answer for all Asians. We already covered that from the perspective of these are all individuals, and that they are representing themselves, but then they may touch a little bit into representing parts of the culture, and I think that's perfectly fine. But your point on the expansiveness of Asia, you're totally right, you're totally accurate, and it's very difficult, right? Because there's gonna be hurts on both sides. So I'm representing some of the hurts that may be reflected by Black people, and Khan's reflecting some of her empathy towards those situations that's occurred. And Asians have every right to be upset with us if they want to. Not saying it's justified or not, but everybody has a perspective if that's the case. So I just wanted to cover that, cover off on that. And there were a few things that we kind of just like wove into the conversation. So I think we should be fine. There was a couple questions here that I'm not sure how we can really roll that in. So I think we're good. Is there anything that you guys would like to say to the audience before we close up? Anyone? Sounds like
I'm good.
Yeah, everyone's all good. So look, everybody out there in Facebook world, those who will watch this on YouTube later, if I were gonna title this, I mean, we're all in this together as much as we possibly can. Yes, our histories may actually be different, but the amount of similarities, and that's where all three of them have actually stated in their own way, are pretty high, and we should build on those similarities so we can actually combine our forces together. And this isn't about an uprising. I'm not sitting here trying to say start a civil war, but it's more about unity. Because if we're bickering against each other, fighting for scraps, as Khan said earlier, it's distracting us from the goal of just being able to be empathetic towards one another. And I would like to see a better bond between Asians and Blacks in the long run, because I think we could benefit from each other a whole lot more than how we complain about things between each other. So I appreciate everybody. Khan, thank you. Mike, thank you. Josh, thank you guys very much for joining this conversation. I totally believe we're going to have another one of these focus on the Asian community going forward. I'm sorry, but thank you guys very much.